Hey everybody, how you doing? Good evening. Scotty Roberts here. Let me get, when I set up all this stuff, it's always lined up, but then you get into YouTube and the camera is treated differently in different programs, apparently. It's wider screen in YouTube for some reason, and I'm not sure why. But there we go. That's about as set up as we're going to be. Hey, Rocky! Dude, I am always on time. You guys are just too early. And Rocky, good to have you here. Lewis, good to have you here. Good to see you. Leslie, good to see you. You've been stacked up in here for a while, apparently. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for being here. And we're going to get rolling here very quickly. But I do like to give a couple of minutes for people to get in the room, and then they'll join us later. And if they miss anything, you can catch it as the archive later. And I do want to ask one very important question, and I want to bring this up with Rocky the next time we broadcast. What is it with cats? My cat, I feed him appropriately. He's a big, fat black cat, and we keep trying to keep him in shape. I feed him the appropriate amount in the morning, about a half a cup of chow in the morning, a half a cup in the evening. But then he'll sneak out at night and he'll go eat all the dog's food. And so we try to put the dog food up. But then he meows at me all frickin' day long, wanting to be fed. He does that where you're walking down the hallway and the cat will zip out in front of you and then turn in front of you like he's going to trip you to try to, and meow the whole time. He's trying to force me into the room where we have his food to feed him. And I'm like, Fatso, you don't need to be fed. So he did that again to me tonight. And then you pour a little bit in his dish, the little half a cup, and he's got his head smack right in there in the bag. He hits the bag and the food gulls all over. I'm like, dumbass, move out of the way so I can put food in your dish. You are not starving, you fat pig. Can I use any more derogatories? And I wish animals had a bit of reason and logic like humans, so I could hurt their feelings. So anyway, at least he doesn't piss in the house. He goes in his box. How's that for reptilian talk? I think cats are offshoots of reptilians. Ron, how you doing? Leslie, good to see you again. Chad, good to see you. Kitten, glad to see you here. Judy, glad you made it in. And let's see, Audrey, nice to have Audrey here. And I think I've got everybody covered that's at least present and accounted for in the chat room. And Francis, I think I got you. And good to have you. Let me take a sip of coffee and we'll get back into this. Now, I'm all self-conscious tonight because both my wife and Rocky have told me I talk too much. So it's like, why don't you just read and then comment afterwards? Well, I can't do that. Because when I'm reading and I see something I've got to comment on, I've either got to pause everybody while I'm reading. Let me take a note here so I know what to comment on later. So I'm going to comment as I go. And 523325, I don't know if you've got another name you're willing to share, but saying, hi, 523325, glad to have you here. But it's good to have you here either way. So, everybody's in the room, everybody's getting lined up, and so we're going to get rolling here. Now, if you remember, we started this book earlier in the week. We read the preface, we read the foreword, we read the introduction. All the forward matter in the book we have taken care of. And now we're going to go into part one of the book. And it's just listed that way, the way the publisher did it. Part one, The Empire of the Serpent. And we're going to hit chapter 1. Now, chapter 1 is lengthy. It goes from page 33 to page 65. So that gives you an idea. That's if you use your swift mathematical minds, that's about 30 pages. 31, maybe, something like that. And so I have not yet figured out the ability to flash up some of the images that are in the book while I'm reading them, other than to hold them and show them to you. So that's what we'll do maybe at time to time and see if we can get something that's cool. And let's see. Holly, good to see you. Nice to have you here. And here we go. This is kingdom of the, what did I say, empire? You got to remember my own book, what I call the empire of the serpent, not the kingdom, part 1, chapter 1. And I've titled this chapter, The Anunnaki and Their Sumerians. I start with a quote by F.J. Trish, and it's from Myth, Magic, and Archaeology. The realm of myth and magic is a dangerous field. Fairies abound, good fairies and bad fairies, dragons and dragon slayers, gods and goddesses, truth and untruth, history and legend, science and fiction, inextricably mixed and fused, all of these things together. But what has archaeology to do with it, you say? Archaeology is concerned with bones and flints, with pots and pans and post holes, with stone and metal. In short, with the material remains and spades to dig them up with. Going back to the very beginning is generally the best place to travel when looking for the roots of any mythology. It's in the fertile soil of creation that we find the seeds that sprouted and grew into the massive, towering beanstalk that has led us to the realm of the giants and the golden goose in the clouds. And whether allegorical, mythological, legendary, or the stuff of fable, there is generally always an incontrovertible fact at the core. Though that thing that started the whole story. And let's make no mistake about it. Once you start delving the depths of comparative ancient stories, their encoded similarities and subsequent decipherment, you enter a muddled world of interpretation, and that will raise both dust and ire. Clearing the air is the monumental task with which you are left. There we go. There are mindsets that are at complete odds here. Like two trains running at high speed toward each other on the same set of tracks. There is bound to be an eventual collision of catastrophic proportion. I can say that fast 3 times. Catastrophic proportion. In this case, the repeating scenario of science colliding with belief and archaeology, running headlong into myth and vice versa. But there has to be an accounting on both parts. Faith and belief open themselves to upholding the sometimes nonsensical, mythical, unprovable, capricious, and many times ambiguous spiritual soul of religion and mythology, whereas science and archaeology will eschew many times with great disdain the unquantifiable as folly, rooting out what they define as fact from fiction, no matter how grounded in their own sense of objectivity and importance, rather like when the science of the day upheld that the earth was the center of the universe and the sun rotated around it. You know, that was once a scientific theory, and you needed to believe that. Those were simply the facts based on the available knowledge and interpretation, and they were religiously adhered to by the academia of the day. Until, that is, science developed the capability to move beyond its limits and recalculate its positions, determining that the earth indeed rotated around the sun and not the other way around. Now, bear with me as I work through laying a little background that will serve as the platform from which we'll engage in an examination of the secret history of the reptilians. Let's see. Scotty must have some of the odd lighting. It's reflecting off his face. Oh, yep, it is actually. I set up a few lights so we have a slight theatrical feel here when I'm doing the readings. And oh, my son put Spock up in the background. Look at that. I have Kirk over there and the sun bust, and my son just put Spock up there. How about that? It's the old Spock. If you're wondering about the color, got to interject here. That's the color from the original premiere. He wore that color. So there you go. Spock is here. He represents Kirk the passion, Spock the science. How about that? All right, here we go. The Naked Truth is the title of this next section. When I completed my work on the rise and fall of the Nephilim, I recall sitting back in my office chair, staring at the ceiling for a long, silent time. In those minutes, I was contemplating what it was that I had just written. In all the research I put into the book, in all the research I did into the book of Genesis, from both Christian and rabbinic standpoints, I found myself drawing further and further away from the God of my youth. It was not a deliberate distancing, but after stepping outside the box and looking back in, I found that the God I had discovered in my youth was not the same God that seemed to materialize after taking a closer look at a more than dogmatic systematic theology. The God I grew up knowing was one of holiness, of benevolence, and ultimately of eternal, sacrificial, propitiating, atoning love. His was a love that transcended everything and embraced me where I was, saving me from myself and the horrors of an eternal existence void of his loving presence. Perhaps this was simply a byproduct, of my need to step outside the box in order to see things from as objective a point of view as possible. This seems to be the problem with a purely academic or secular examination of these things. When you distance yourself from the possibility of the weird, odd, spiritual, and mythological, you deliberately set yourself up to look beyond the wonder and the possibilities to funneling all research through a sterile filter. Now, you get that? You get what I mean by that? When you become the skeptical scientific person when you're examining something, and so you want to push yourself away from all the weirdness, all the ghosts, the goblins, the demons, all of that spiritual and weird talk. The skeptic in you has to do that in order to look at it. What you believe is through a pure filter. But in order to do that, you've got to push everything else out. And is that really purity, or is that so sterile that you're missing the boat? So who's explaining Spock to Rocky? I bet if Spock worked on his emotional issues, he'd be pretty cool to party with. Yeah, there you go. Spock had no emotions. So says David. Welcome, David. And Lewis, I'm all new to this book. Fiction, research, nonfiction. There you go. Okay. So let's move on. Perhaps this was simply a byproduct. Okay, I read that part. What is even more profound is to observe the distillation of research by secular scholarship, and that the scientific and skeptical approach to biblically themed topics, such as the Nephilim, seems to operate under a preconceived notion that the Bible cannot be taken literally in any form, including its historicity. One critic of the rise and fall of the Nephilim stated that I erred simply by placing any veracity at all in the biblical record. However, it's been quantified time and time again that the Bible is quite irrefutably strong in its historical presentations, albeit at times vague, limited, and deliberately not forthcoming in detailed information, as the contextual themes, inclusive of some historical data, were meant to present a faith principle rather than historical documentation. Therefore, the historical information was sometimes sketchy at best. Skeptical researchers, honest to their scholarship, are finding it increasingly more difficult to dispute the overwhelming archaeological evidence for biblical historical facts. For the biblical accuracy of the historical. Let me start that sentence again. I messed up. Therefore, the historical information was sometimes sketchy at best. Skeptical researchers, honest to their scholarship, now I lost my place again, are finding it increasingly more difficult to dispute the overwhelming archaeological evidence for the historical accuracy of biblical accounts. Now, mind you, we're not talking about faith accuracy or woo-woo accuracy or magical mythical accuracy. We're talking about the actual accuracy of the historical account. Any corroboration of biblical historical facts, however, does not by any means emphatically state that the faith story wrapped around these events is truth, but it does lend the veracity of the Bible to the veracity of the Bible as a historically accurate document, aside from the religious and spiritual aspects of Judaism and Christianity. Biblical accounts that include such things as listing of nations, historic personages, customary rituals, and colloquial practices have been verified by archaeological evidence and anthropological research. Secular academicians who have cornerstone careers on criticism of the biblical history have many times found themselves humiliated by new discoveries that validate the biblical accounts they had previously deemed to be myth, academic embarrassment. Among these are such discoveries as the existence of the obscure Hittites, King David of Israel, Goliath of Gath, and Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea during the lifetime of Jesus of Nazareth. Nelson Glueck, noted 20th century Jewish archaeologist, whose work in biblical archaeology led to the discovery of more than 1,500 ancient sites, put it this way, quote, "It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a single biblical reference. Sources of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline or in exact detail historical statements in the Bible." And David asked me if I've ever seen a person shapeshift. Yeah, my wife, when she gets really mad at me, it's like her skin splits open and peels back from her skull, and fire comes out of her eye sockets, and her voice turns into this hideous thing. That's shape-shifting as far as I'm concerned. But it has nothing to do with this chapter, so we could maybe get to that another time. Not surprisingly, as some think of biblical record as being inaccurate and rife with faith stories alone, when stacked up against non-biblical accounts of historical events, the scriptural narratives reveal unflinching veracity. In his 1919 collection of essays and other journal work, A Scientific Investigation of the Old Testament, R.D. Wilson, who was fluent in 45 ancient languages and dialects, inclusive of all biblical language of common etymological origin, such as Hebrew, Aramaic, Assyrian, Phoenician, Sumerian, Babylonian dialects, Ethiopic, as well as several Egyptian and Persian dialects. He engaged in a meticulous analysis of 29 different monarchs from 10 different nations mentioned in Masoretic texts, the Old Testament. By way of comparative analysis, every one of these monarchs had corresponding archaeological artifacts documented by secular historians containing their names, syllable by syllable, consonant by consonant. Wilson demonstrated that the monarchical names as recorded in the biblical record matched the findings of secular historians and archaeological artifacts, accurate in minute detail to the chronological order of the kings. Conversely, Wilson also demonstrated that many secular historical accounts were often filled with gross inaccuracies and were eventually deemed quite unreliable. Ptolemy, the famed librarian of Alexandria, and even Herodotus were horrendously inaccurate in their documentation of royal names, and in many instances even misspelled the names in the Library of Alexandria, to the point of nearly being unable to be recognized when compared to their respective archaeological artifacts or ancient monuments. Their research simply required more evidentiary research to establish any sort of accurate corroboration. Even the well-known 19th century archaeologist and historian Sir William Ramsay, a noted scholarly skeptic of biblical history, converted to Christianity after his travels to Asia Minor to conduct meticulous research and archaeological excavations into the New Testament's Gospel according to Luke and Luke's follow-up historical record, the Acts of the Apostles. The evidence Ramsay uncovered continually and incontrovertibly supported the historical record of the biblical writings of Luke. At a time when many secular historians and scholars dismiss the existence of most of Luke's record of governmental officials and geographical nameplaces, Ramses' archaeological digs actually flipped the naysayers' claims on their heads. Without error, Ramsay established through his excavations that Luke was accurate in naming countries, cities, islands, Roman officials, and many other salient details of historical record contained in the New Testament writings. As a result of his discoveries, Ramsay wrote, I began with a mind unfavorable to it, but more recently I found myself brought into contact with the Book of Acts as an authority for topography, antiquities, and society of Asia Minor. It was gradually born upon me that in various details the biblical narrative showed marvelous truth. Ramsay also wrote, Luke is a historian of first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, this author should be placed with the very greatest historians. End quote. Although the previous paragraphs may have seemed a bit of a rabbit trail, not that I do that much, for which I've become very well known, as there is so much information that could be incorporated to illuminate any tidbit of information out there, I included them for the purpose of establishing the fact that not all religious literature is merely faith-based alone, despite many secular skeptical opponents in their own particular biases wishing it were so. When you step outside the box of a particular faith and look to find corroboration between historical data and scriptural teaching, using the faith writing as a guide, not a filter, you will find that biblical history in particular stands the test of historical scrutiny. And I've got to tell you here, especially where I write here, this filter of when you use, I'm going to repeat that. When you look to find corroboration between historical data and scriptural teaching, using faith as a guide, not a filter, you'll find that the biblical history in particular stands the test of historical scrutiny. Now, I got to tell you, hey, PK, how you doing? Good to see you. Melanie, good to see you as well. Amanda, good to see you. And Michelle, glad you made it in. Kay, glad to see you there. Here, there in the chat room here. So now, what I'm saying by this is, as if I didn't explain it well enough, I had one of my old seminary professors, when I talked to him about the stuff I was writing, he said, now remember, Scotty, he says, you need to use the Bible as your filter for whatever you write about. And I said, I think that would be a mistake, though. I said, because then I'm writing within the faith. I'm writing a story about faith. I need to extricate myself from that and look back in and not use faith as a filter, but as a guide while I'm looking at historical fact. So that's what I mean by all of that. Okay. Leslie, good to see you. So, okay, I was just seeing if there was something over there in the chat room. And just see, I'm looking at 1400 till now. I'm not sure where you are here in the conversation, but we'll come back to that. We'll come back to the chat room. All right, let's move on. Let's see where I left off. Here we are. However, the historical data may be reliable. However, because the historical data may be reliable, this does not always necessitate the spiritual information it's housed within is universal truth. Though I can insist that the Constitution of the United States is an historical document and uphold it as closely as possible to its original intent, there will be others who interpret its words through different filters, thereby causing decades of debate on its veracity versus its interpretability. The same is true with religious writings. On a spiritual level, In my personal universe, I got a hair in my mouth or something. Sorry, cat hair. From the stupid cat. On a spiritual level, my personal universe was very small back in the days of my youth. And God was a God, as I was told, who waited for me with open arms to take my troubled life and make it something beautiful through his saving, undeserved grace. Yet the older I got and the more I dug into the topic of the biblical Nephilim, the more I found a God emerging from the murkiness that was in nature and human-like emotional volatility, ultimately detached from humanity. A God who didn't give, and pardon my plain vernacular here, two shits about humanity. This is my mythological interpretation, as opposed to historical veracity. But it is the result of my spiritual studies and evolving understanding of the spiritual content of those ancient documents. Despite all the teaching about God and all the systematic theology in my Bible school and seminary days, the Elohim of the Old Testament seemed more concerned and focused on the stuffs going on in the realms of the heavens rather than he did with human beings. There are many instances in the Bible's stories of God's dealings with mankind where human life was as dispensable as yesterday's news, and several occasions where God insisted on their extermination and even followed through with it by divine judgment or mandates passed on to his followers. And once I discovered that the Elohim were a plurality, a pantheon, if you will, dominated by a superior member of their caste of gods, the one singular omniscient, omnipresent God of my upbringing took a decidedly rear seat in the family van. Although there are plenty of scriptures that were interpreted as God's presence, his love, and an interaction with people, there were even more that spoke to his ability to be as human and unjust as any earthly monarch, establishing his jealous reign over his subjects, enacting the wiping out of non-believers and the genocide of whole peoples in his justified wrath. There was even an account in the Old Testament book of Exodus where God was going to destroy his promised people, and it took the intervention of Moses to hold back God's wrath, reminding God of his promise to Abraham, and that's what caused God to repent of the evil he was going to do. So says Exodus 32:14. The Jewish Midrash teaches Ecclesiastes 5:4 that these things annul evil decrees. 1. Prayer. 2. Charity or righteousness. 3. Repentance. That's teshuvah. And in striking contrast, however, in Bamidbar Rabbah 23:8, you can cross-reference Exodus 32:14 with this, we read that Moses came forward and made God repent. In this case, it was the intervention of a righteous human being that preceded prayer, righteousness, or teshuvah on the part of evildoers. There are several instances in Hebrew scripture where men intervened and exchanged and changed the mind of God. Moses, Abraham, and Jonah in particular seemingly all had the influence to reverse what can be understood as God's evil intention or inclination. Exodus 32:9-14, the passage says this: God said to Moses, I look at this people. Oh, what a stubborn, hard-hearted people. Let me alone now. Let me alone, God says. Let me alone now. Give my anger free rein to burst into flames and incinerate them. But I'll make a great nation out of you instead, God says to Moses. Imagine that. This is the God of love that we go to church and we worship and so on in our Christian circles and in synagogue. He says, give my anger free rein to burst into flames and incinerate them. And you know why this was done? This was after the incident with the golden calf. And this is God saying, I am so pissed off by these people that I'm going to incinerate them. Now I look at that and I say, and this is just a side note, I'm building a case here in the book for something. That's why I'm going into all this. But it makes me think that, is this the God of holiness, the God of love, the God who created the universe, the God who gave his only begotten Son, the God that doesn't want us to go to hell, the God that wants us to go to heaven? All these things we're taught. Is this that God? Is this the omniscient, omnipresent, all-knowing, all-powerful God who created the universe out of nothingness? The universe falls from his fingertips. He creates all of this, and then he creates humankind, and yet he has that ability to be so pissed off by finite humans in his infiniteness that he wants to just, its face split down the middle and the skin peeled back and flames shot out of his eye sockets and out of his mouth is flame, and I'm going to incinerate these people. See, we've tied in shape-shifting now. Is this the God of the Bible? Yes. It goes on in that passage. Moses tried to calm his God down, it says. Moses said, "Why, God, would you lose your temper with your people? Why, you brought them out of Egypt in a tremendous demonstration of power and strength. Why let the Egyptians say he had it in for them? He brought them out so he could kill them in the mountains, wipe them right off the face of the earth. Stop your anger. Think twice about bringing evil against your people!" Exclamation point. Think of Abraham, think of Isaac and Israel, your servants to whom you gave your word, telling them, "I will give you many children, as many as the stars in the sky, and I will give this land to your children as their land forever." And God did think twice, the passage says. He decided not to do the evil he had threatened against his people. And that's the end of the passage. And yeah, Leslie, you're right. Those of us who are parents know how angry our children make us when they test us. Imagine doing that on the scale God has to. Except God's not a human being. God is supposed to be, what did God say in the book of Isaiah in chapter 55? How much higher are my ways than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts? As the rain comes down from heaven and waters the earth and evaporates and goes back to the sky, and you don't really get that. That's how much higher my ways are than your ways. We're talking about a God as opposed to humans. Is God volatile? Does God have the ability to get pissed off? Or is God, this is supposed to be the same God who a moment is as 1,000 years. The Bible says he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He exists outside the plane of linear time. He created all that is, yet he could be so pissed off that he acts like a human parent. I have trouble with that. And I'm not trying to dismantle your argument as much as I've dealt with these very same questions. And I've often wondered, was God like a parent in that when he created human beings to have free will, something that could say, see a God, and express their free will because they don't want to believe in him? Did he create something that had never existed before? And therefore, even the infinite, all-powerful, omniscient, all-present God of the universe had to figure out how to deal with this creation that he imbued with free will? I've used that before. When I was in ministry, I used to teach that. I remember teaching specifically about disappointment with God. And I said, God is like a parent. It's this stair-step thing. He created something that had never existed before, and that was something that could tell him no. But does that still then take away from the nature of God his ability to, or his attribute that he is beyond all of that? He is God, very God. If human beings can figure that out, why couldn't God? That's where my question comes in. Leslie, you say, I do think on a father level, he has the same negative feelings we do as parents, as well as sure, maybe on a father level, but he's more than that. He's the God of the universe, according to God. So that makes him different. He's supposed to be one that if he knows the end before it started, which is what the Bible tells us, God knows the end before it even begins. Before you were formed in the womb, I knew you. I knew who you were. Now that, I think, can also be referenced to our pre-existence prior to birth, human birth. But God is supposed to be this being that knows everything as if it's a moment, because he's infinite in the teaching. Or is the teaching wrong? Is what we've been taught wrong? Is God a finite being? As some have flippantly said, human beings are the experiment of God. Is that true? Is God volatile, or is God stable? God loses temper? I lost my temper with my 4-year-old girl tonight because she was, as sweet and cute as she is, she was mouthing off like a randy sailor to my wife. And I was sitting in here working on something, and I perked up. I said, hey! And I walked out there, and I said, what did you say to your mother? And she gives me this, and it goes to shoulder and turns. I said, the young lady, you turn right back around and you look at me in the eyes. And I got in her face and said, you look in my eyes. I said, do I look like I'm saying something funny to you? And I said, if you want, and yes, folks, I'm a parent. I believe in spanking when it's appropriate. At certain levels, at certain ages, at certain times. They say, the psychology says that agrees with it. If you're spanking past 4 or 5 years old, it's too late. Spanking, I'm not talking about beating them with a baseball bat, or as the Old Testament Levitical law said, if your child is disobedient or mouths off to you, drag him down to the gate of the city and have him stoned. What parent would do that to their child? Unless their child has gone so far, I've got to look at that passage again. Does that passage mean just disobedience, or is there something more to that? Because I could never imagine wanting to kill my son or my daughter because they mouthed off to me. Unless I'm living in a society, a patriarchal society, like some we know of nowadays, where if a girl mouths off to her dad, he can kill her. And the dad will gladly do it to prove that he's the man. So, different topic. Sorry, you can see how we rabbit trail here and how we probably won't get through 30 pages tonight. So, Leslie, none of that was to take you to task at all. I'm talking because I've talked about all these things before, and it makes me pause. These are the things that have made me stop being the kind of believer in God that I was. And while I'm not an atheist because I believe that there is a God there, some divine being there, I'm more agnostic than anything else. I've turned away from that. Some of that was digging into all this kind of material and starting to dig deep enough to start to see what God was made of in the scripture, on the linguistic base and all of that stuff. So anyway, let me move on. In short, there are several biblical instances in which God looked more like Zeus, Neptune, Elil, and the other superior reigning gods of mythology than he did a real, substantive heavenly Father. Look, Leslie, we're already getting to this, and I'm not singling you out, we just talked about this from your questions. We're hitting it right here in the book. God began to look no different than all the other false gods we learned about in comparative religions courses. He started to take on the traits and the attributes of a God created by man for the purpose of rallying the troops or controlling the erstwhile yet sinful courses of common folk who needed to be reined in and controlled. The kind of God that we describe in the Bible, that we learned of, is the kind of God that people in power wanting to control the masses created in order to control those masses. And I heard some of those arguments when I was younger, and I didn't buy into them at all. That's just non-believers until I started digging in more. Further, as I began the research into ancient religions for the purpose of this book, I found much of what I had believed by faith to be the only one true religion to be simply the stuffs of revitalized, rewritten, reworked, possibly even plagiarized religions of thousands of years prior to the writing of the compiled books we refer to today as the Bible. When Moses penned the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible in the Christian Old Testament, in and around 1400 BCE, and I believe there's I'm recapping some of this, I believe there's absolutely no reason to doubt that these books were at least originally authored by Moses, and that he indeed was a real historical person, as established in the dating system set forth in my previous work. It's very clear that Moses borrowed information from the early Sumerian and Akkadian religions, recorded in cuneiform 1,500 to 2,000 years earlier, sometime between 2,500 and 2,800 BCE. My note, author's note here, the rise and fall of the Nephilim, when stating that the date of the Sumerian civilization flourished around 4,500 to 4,800 BC, I meant to say 2,500 to 2,800 BC. It was a typo I missed, folks, in the original book, but inadvertently stated the number of the years from today backward rather than the correct date. The things that can get missed even in your most meticulous editing. This book was edited by me several times, by other people several times, by my publisher several times, and I missed that date. So that's just an author's note about the rise and fall of the Nephilim. The evolution and migration of humans from the Fertile Crescent region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, south and west into the Canaanite region, brought with it also the evolution and transformation of ancient religion. The Hebrews picked up the name El and incorporated it into their religion, their own homespun version of a superior god and the pantheon of Sumerians. Elul became Elohim, El Elyon, El Shaddai of the Hebrew religion, while Enki, Iyah, the base word for Yahweh, became Yahweh or Jehovah. However, when discussing this very issue of etymology of ancient god names, my friend and Byzantine Catholic priest, Father Jack Ashcraft, said to me in a personal conversation, the word Allah can be found in use in the Syrian churches. The etymology isn't the issue. Mohammed merely used a common word in his tribe for deity. The issue is the character, will, and salvific history of the deity concerned. If they do not match, they cannot be the same deity. While considering this anthropological migration of religion and its adaptation of cultural words and names, it's interesting to note that the name Allah was one of the pagan deities of the Quraysh. As a youth, Muhammad, who later founded the Islamic religion, participated in the worship of 360, I think I said 292 the other day, but 360 pagan gods of the Kaaba in Mecca, overseen by the Quraysh tribe to which Muhammad belonged. As Muhammad grew up, he was influenced by Jewish and Christian monotheists who condemned the polytheism of the Kaaba. At some point in Muhammad's life, he became convinced that the polytheism was completely incompatible for a nationalistic-based religion and sought to reject the 360 pagan gods with which he'd been raised. Muhammad was and by the way, I have footnotes in the book, and you can look up all the footnotes. There's several footnotes through this passage. Muhammad was converted to the concept of monotheism through the influence and teachings of Judaism and Christianity. However, being a proud nationalistic Arabic, he sought not to change his people's beliefs completely, but turned reformer and sought to reboot. He was the Martin Luther, I suppose, of his day, so to speak. He sought to reboot his native pagan religion rather than adopt a completely different belief system altogether, such as Christianity. As a result, Muhammad took the chief pagan god of the Kaaba in Mecca, his name was Hubal, Allah, and chose him to be his new monotheistic god. This god was already considered the chief god among the other gods at Kaaba. Muhammad's strategy was simple. Rather than converting all of the Arabic people to the monotheism of Christianity, he merely banished the other 359 pagan gods and chose Hubal Allah to be the one and only God, thus giving Islam Allah. In a very real sense, Muhammad created Islam out of whole cloth for the purpose of solidifying Arabic nationalism under one God and one religion, much the same as Constantine with Christianity in the early 300s AD. And if you were with me for the reading of the rise and fall of the Nephilim, remember the chapter on Constantine. It's exactly what he did. There has to be one religion and one God to equate the fact that we have one nation or one kingdom or empire and one king. This is in essence what Muhammad was doing. Now, yeah, this was, Kay, you're right. This was written quite a while ago. This book I wrote, it was released in 2013. So that gives you an idea. All right. The last thing I wish to do is dissuade anyone from their personal faith or traditional beliefs. However, in saying that, it also must be recognized that even the most sacredly held names in our most holy beliefs have come from earlier sources. Civilization developed and migrated across the globe, and with that came the migration and evolution of religious thought. Just as the early Christian church dislocated pagan tribes and usurped their places of high worship, burning down their sacred groves only to erect chapels and cathedrals in their place, so did ancient humanity as they borrowed and transformed religion into newer modes of practice and objects of worship. This train of thought, of course, represents what religious scholars would call a secular view. It eliminates the need for faith and filters the history of humanity and the development of religion and religious stories through the strainer of archaeology and anthropology. Accordingly, evangelicals and staunch adherents to Judeo-Christian faith, as well as Islam and other dogmatic faiths, would view this migration of religion and evolution of language as nothing more than a secularized explanation for something they accept took place by faith. At best, they would accept by faith that the secular view can be merged with the religious mythology. Insisting that so-called secular left despises them, evangelical Christians maintain that postmodernism has moved the secularists to abandon absolutism for the more comfortable, objective, relative definition of truth. Evangelical Christians believe there is absolute truth which applies to all people in all cultures for all times. Evangelicals recognize that this objective and absolute truth is found ultimately in one true God and in his revelation given to us personally in Jesus Christ and in the Bible. And I have a footnote there that we could look it up, but I'm not going to do that at the moment. In a conversation in July 2012, during the writing of these paragraphs, Micah Hanks, good friend of mine, prominent futurist and author, he's a radio show host, he's authored many books, he's a public speaker. He said this to me: I think when one begins to look at the anthro side of things, our inherent humanity is put in new perspective for us. It becomes easy to dismiss any kind of divinity at that point. But divinity is faith. In what? Faith can't exist without the hope for something greater. It's merely that glue which binds us to the divine. Whether or not a God exists, many have faith, and many who choose not to believe lack that faith, even if he is still there nonetheless. Or is our faith merely another human construct, much like thought, sight, and other things. It's the end of my quote from Micah. And then, rather tongue-in-cheek, Micah added, I would like to know if the Darseni of Plebeius, TE17, with their cold, stony moon, have an equivalent word to our English faith. This is referencing some made-up science fiction. We'll cover this more in detail later, but suffices to say that at this point in our study, the Hebrew Bible starts to look more and more as if it is simply the Hebrew version, now the Judeo-Christian version, of greater and much older worldly events. Could the Old Testament be nothing more than mere religious myth as opposed to the absolute on the spiritual truth of the universe, as Judeo-Christianity teaches? The more we investigate our religious origins through the many myths, legends, and dogmatic theologies out there, the more we find that the similarities are staggering. Is there a one true religion where God is the benevolent ruler of all that exists? Or are these collective mythologies simply different versions of common events, with common threads running throughout them all? Was there some proto-religion from which all ancient religions drew their basic information? Or did there exist some magnificent story from which all religions built their versions of origins? You know what that makes me think of? Is the discovery of Göbekli Tepe. If you're familiar with Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, that series of circular temples, they think, or structures that were meticulously buried by hand, but they date back 12,000 years. Some say that these structures were part of the proto-religious story. Some have mused that they were built because they knew a great flood was coming, so on and so forth. And there's animals that we don't even have anymore. There's animals that we recognize and animals we don't recognize all over those stones. So it's a very interesting thought. And what of this pervasive presence of the serpent that emerges not only in the Sumerian and Hebrew religions, but in many prevalent religious mythologies the world over? What of this supposed mysterious race of reptilian beings that seems to run through the undercurrent of humanity's mythos? Are these creatures the mere stuffs of man's creation? The devils in the dark of the conspiratorial minded? Or are they the diaphanous stuff of ether? I want to look back. We've made it to page 44 from page 35, I think we started. So we're going to keep going. We're going to go on about 50 minutes. Let me take a drink of coffee. Ron Frisbee, amazing artist, by the way. Go check him out. He says, I've seen in my studies that the Old Testament, in part and parcel, has been plagiarized from older texts, from Sumerian writings, and from Babylon. You are spot on, Ron. And this is what I was referencing here. Göbekli Tepe is pretty amazing, Audrey. Let's see, as we go on, let's see what's in here. If there's anything I want to hit before we go into the new section here. Let's see. Okay, I'm seeing some political talk. That's cool. So where are the reptilians? David, they're in the book here. We'll get to them. We're building a case. David Moser, if I just came out and said, reptilians exist, we've seen them on stone tablets and seen them in writing, so therefore they exist. And Zechariah Sitchin is right. Rather than me write a whole book, I'll end after this one paragraph. Go read Sitchin's work, or David Icke. What I'm doing here is establishing a case. So we're going to get there. We'll get there. Yeah, my footnotes have footnotes. That's right, Michelle. So, all right, let's move on. Reptiles lay eggs. You're right, Amanda, they do. Isn't that interesting? You wonder what eggs are out there. Hey, in the movie Alien and Aliens and all the Aliens movies, didn't they lay eggs? Were they supposed to be reptilian in nature? All right, the next section of this chapter is archaeology and myth. Let's define these two words. Archaeology, the recover and study of material objects such as graves, buildings, tools, artwork, and human remains for the purpose of investigating the structure and behavior of past cultures. Archaeologists rely on physical remains as clues to the emergence and development of human societies and civilizations. Anthropologists, by contrast, interact with living people to study their cultures. That's from the American Heritage New Dictionary of Cultural Literacy. Definition of myth: a traditional or legendary story, usually concerning some being or ancient event, hero or event, with or without a determinable basis for fact or a natural explanation, especially one that is concerned with deities and demigods and explains some practice, rite, or phenomenon of nature. Stories or matter of this kind, realm of myth, any invented story, idea, or concept. His account of the event is pure myth, as an example. An imaginary or fictitious thing or person. An unproved or false collective belief that is used to justify a social institution. This is from the Collins English Dictionary, complete and unabridged, the 10th edition. So, I was recently part of a live debate where an archaeological PhD, now this is back in 2012 while I was writing this, where an archaeological PhD, by the way, a Harvard archaeological PhD, was debating him on certain topics, made the emphatic statement that myth was merely mankind's fantasies and nothing more. Though it's true that a myth can at times be a mere story, removing itself far from the status of reliable historical resource that the increasingly scientifically minded discipline of archaeoanthropological disciplines would utilize, myths are not always as rooted in the realms of fantasy as the esteemed halls of academia might consider them to be. Of necessity to a richer understanding of our past, an interdisciplinary dialogue efficacious to the future development of both mythological and archaeological disciplines should exist. Perhaps somewhere along the way, you will come to find the union of archaeology and mythology is far from being grounded in the realm of fairy tale. In context to the subject matter of this book, I'm hailing back to the creation story as written in the Old Testament of the Bible. Although the story's creation, as told in the book of Genesis, is not the first of humanity's creation stories, it is one that tends to be the most familiar in a broader sense and contains the roots of this discussion. So it's here that I'll begin this search for fact, buried deep within the religious machinations and mythologies of faith. Also note that, though we may be able to identify facts within the linguistics and stories of the ancient texts, there is still no real way to quantify those facts as being hard evidence as to how things actually happened. But the multiplicity of creation accounts spread across a multiplicity of cultures and religions does give us a visible common thread that, when viewed from outside the box of any particular religion or culture, presents a picture comprised of commonalities that are pan-cultural. You get that? The creation and the myth stories are so similar between all these different cultures that they present a sort of pan-cultural commonality. Does this merely underscore the notion that humanity's civilizations, cultures, and religions have all evolved in equal fashion as one another? Or does it establish that there is a common thread woven throughout all cultures, beginning with a singular common event lost in primordial antiquity? Each subsequent culture then ascribes its own version of events, character names, twists on the original story, remanufacturing to adapt to their own values and politics, not to mention the unpierceable veils, the individual accounts of encounters and experiences that cannot be substantiated. that are wholly important to any consideration of any of these spiritualistic, therefore hyper-speculative things. You get that, folks, that we've applied each layer. It's like an onion, as Shrek said. Shrek said, it's like layers. I'm an onion. And the same thing with all this. It's these layers put one on top of the other of each successive belief system, adding their own perceptions or their own version, their own interpretations onto the original story. And what's all the way down at the core? There's a bulb at the core with all these layers on top. Maybe Spock was reptilian, David. I don't know. Is that in context? Are you guys talking about Spock and reptilians? I don't know. He didn't have scaly skin or anything like that we know of. He was greenish in his inception. And then they turned him, he was reddish, and they turned him a little more bluish and greenish, these overtones to his skin. But there are no reptilian shirts. Lewis, there are no reptilian shirts. Okay, I moved on. I've jumped down. So I don't know, David, what do you think? Was Spock a reptilian? I don't know. I didn't write about him in the book, I don't think. I don't think I have any Spock references, but we'll see. Listen on. Maybe we'll learn something. Next section, Adam, Eve, and the Prince. The book of Genesis tells us that Adam and Eve were the first couple. That's according to Judeo-Christian theology. Whether you believe they were real people evolved from lower species, metaphoric stick figures, mythological characters, or the actual living human beings spiritually set against a deeply encoded message, the Hebrew religion tells us that they were created by God and given dominion over a garden paradise, and commanded to not eat of certain fruit growing on certain trees, lest they die, period. Now enter, stage left, the trickster character, Nakash, the serpent. Although never identified in the text as Lucifer, Satan, or the devil, those names being attributed to him much later in biblical scriptures, 1,000 years later, by the way, this character has become religiously synonymous with the devilish figure who led humanity away from God, thereby ushering in original sin and the resultant fall of mankind from the state of grace before a holy God, placing humanity in need of a spiritual savior redeemer. This serpent character is also established from that point forward as the evil force, ever present and working to thwart the network of a gracious and loving God in the affairs of humanity. Nakash is the Hebrew word that, when translated into English, means serpent, trickster, crafty magician, bringer of knowledge, illuminator, bright shining one. According to Psalm 82, God, appearing in the singular version of the word Elohim, refers to the other gods of heaven, the divine council, as the Elohim, using the very same Hebrew word in its plural version, also calling them the bright, shining princes of heaven. In this instance, you have the God of the Hebrew Bible declaring the existence of a caste of gods, or minor gods, over which he has authority, but whom he calls by the same name. Note that he never refers to them as angels. We established that in the last book. The Hebrew word for angels, malach, which means messenger, never appears in the passage. Noted Hebrew and ancient Semitic language scholar Michael S. Heiser, whom I respect greatly, put it this way: in light of the serpentine appearance of divine beings in Yahweh's presence that we have in Genesis chapter 3 is wordplay. That is, Eve was not talking to a snake. She was speaking to a bright, shining, upright being who was serpentine in appearance and who was trying to bewitch her with lies. In other words, Eve was in the presence of one of the sons of God. That's the Elohim, the divine council. These beings were not angelic in nature, but were beings that possessed free will and were more powerful than the angels, the messengers of God. When Psalm 8, 4-5 speaks of the creation of human beings, utilizing the phrase a little lower than the angels, is how God created humans. The Hebrew text actually renders this as a little lower than the Elohim. That makes it completely different. Eve was actually interacting with a member of the divine council who did not share God, Yahweh's enthusiasm for his new creation, human beings. I'm convinced by ancient linguistic use of the same words that the serpent in the Garden of Eden story is one of these bright shining princes of heaven, who is none other than the bright shining one who appears in Genesis' account of Adam and Eve as Nakash, the serpent character who seduces and impregnates Eve after she sits at his feet to learn the knowledge he bestows. He's the bringer of forbidden knowledge. There was also another word attributed to him. He was the bringer of chaos, which was a neutral word in the Hebrew, just the flipping of things around. Let's see. I'm seeing what you're writing here. So is Eve the woman of the old world? Is Eve the woman of the old world who were taken to breed men killed on crosses? I don't know. We'll see. Lewis asks, but wouldn't that contradict the verse we are created in the Elohim image? Not necessarily, because Elohim was the chief god. Elohim. And then there was the plurality of gods, the Elohim. As you see in Genesis, and we covered this in Nephilim, but Genesis chapter 6, it talks about the sons of God, or the B'nai Ha-Elohim, those who are of the Elohim. And that Elohim in Psalm 82 speaks in front of a group of the Elohim. Elohim is the name used for God 3,000 times in the Old Testament. But that God, Elohim, refers to this group of the divine council as Elohim, equating them to himself. But they were the B'nai Ha-Elohim, the sons of the Elohim, those who were bequeathed of the Elohim, those who were of the Elohim. And then you notice in Genesis 3 that God continually speaks in the plurality. We, us, we must go down and prevent them from doing this, and so on. The humans have eaten of the tree of life and have become just like us. And he's not referring to the Trinity there, as we established a long time ago. The Trinity didn't exist in the Hebrew religion. In Judaism, they did not have a Trinity at this time. And by the way, they also did not have a definitive character as Satan. Satan was a title. There was always the article put before the word the Satan, as you see in the book of Job. So, going on, I hope that addresses that a little bit. Amanda's going to town here. She's got some ideas over there. Believe what you will, as your faith might dictate regarding the connection to Lucifer, the star of the morning, the bright shining presence of the glory of God. But the big question to ask is whether or not this teaching in the Hebrew scripture is a factual accounting or an elaborate cover story for much deeper events involving much more detail. We will most probably never know if Adam and Eve or Nakash ever existed truly, at least outside the realm of the faith story and what you believe and accept by faith. But historical evidence does exist that links all these characters to other personages in different creation mythologies throughout many other ancient religious cultures, establishing a common thread or undercurrent, as we'll see later in this chapter. Let me say again, at this still early point in this study, that it's not my intent to offend anyone's religious or spiritual beliefs or sensibilities, nor is it my desire to trounce scientific research or input. My personal background is one that has its foundations in the Christian faith and academia. That is where I received all my formal yet incomplete biblical training and seminary education. And I must state again for emphasis that I do not by any means wish to dissuade anyone from believing what they trust by faith in their own heart to be true. I would like to present some questions, however. throughout the entirety of this book that may challenge those beliefs. When making comparative forays into religious teachings that span many different cultures, one is left to decipher the messages and determine in his own heart that which he believes to be true and that which he must discard as false. Not to mention what one can or cannot accept as faith on the basis of archaeological and anthropological research. Two schools of study that must completely separate themselves from faith issues in order to retain integrity in fact-finding. As with my previous work on the Nephilim, I'm sure that there will be some who will fear for eternal salvation of my soul, if not the backslidden state of my position with the Christian God. Suffice it to say that our personal faiths and religions, if adhered to, play harsh taskmasters in our lives and with what we understand to be our eternal souls. We are, as Jeff Dougherty might say, and we've talked about ad infinitum, we are indoctrinated. And sometimes you got to step back and say, do I need to unindoctrinate myself, as Jeff's tagline for his for what he does states so clearly and so eloquently. Add to the faith. I'm going to start that sentence again. Suffice it to say that our personal faiths and religions, if adhered to, play harsh taskmasters in our lives and with what we understand to be our eternal souls. Add to that faith mix the necessity of stepping back to examine other theologies outside its reach, then blend them all together with mythology, and you'll find that there may exist something else completely different lying beneath the surface. There just may be things in the anthro-archaeological mythological record that challenges you to look beyond the limits of your religious affiliations and think outside the damn box. All right. Next section in this chapter. We've got 11-12. We're going to go for a while yet. Slaves and freedom fighters. Now, what I'm going to read to you right here is a section from one of the Sumerian or Mesopotamian, however you want to look at it, cuneiform tablets. It's from the Tale of Atrahasis. And it says this: while the Anunnaki are sitting before you, Belit Ili, the womb goddess, is present. Let the womb goddess create offspring, and let man bear the load of the gods. Create primeval man that he may bear the yoke. Let him bear the yoke, the work of Elil. Let man bear the yoke of the gods. That's from Atrahasis, Tablet 1, which I've got a picture of it here. This is the cuneiform tablet. This is where, once I figure out my certain abilities, but there's the cuneiform tablet. Part of the Tale of Atrahasis comes from that. It's in the British Museum. Now, let's go back a little further than the writing of Genesis to ancient Mesopotamian civilization of Sumer. According to their ancient cuneiforms, they were ruled by the Anunna, the Anunnaki, their god-casted beings who came to the earth from the heavens. As the story goes, these gods, weary of performing their own manual labor, bred into or genetically engineered and manipulated the DNA of the humans of the Mesopotamian region, who roamed, as they said, as wild beasts. They did this to create a slave caste to do their work for them. As the story continues to unfold, the humans began to feel the weight of their enslavement. Theirs was an unwilling servitude. Accordingly, as time went on, the cruel hand of the slave masters became unbearable to the humans, and some of the Anunnaki overlords went rogue, launching a conspiracy to free the humans and teach them the knowledge of science and spirituality and the art of civilization, thus elevating them to the same godlike status as the Anunnaki. Doesn't that sound an awful lot like Genesis 3? We'll get to that because I don't want to give some spoilers away here. The leader of the rebel freedom fighters was none other than Elil's brother god, an Anunnaki named Enki, also known as Ea, that's spelled E-A, Ea, in the neighboring Akkadian culture. When seeking to understand any ancient text, now this is important, folks. When seeking to understand any ancient text, it's from Biblical Hebrew to cuneiform, it's important to recognize a few things up front. One, the language in which it was written, as most ancient languages have a logic all their own that does not translate well into modern English. Two, the people for whom the stories were being written. Their understanding of the stories and the way in which they presented could have been vastly different than what we understand in a modern reading. And three, the context of the text in relation to the people for whom it was being written. Again, our current day understanding being completely different as to what ancient peoples would have been. The poetic, picturesque language of these ancient Sumerian texts, though beautiful in their presentation as ancient religious accounts, offer no source to quantify their veracity, thereby leaving themselves to stand only as religious history and myth. The importance of sources and verifiable information matter wholly when deciphering ancient texts. But 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, there was little need for this. If there existed even the slightest concept that far in the future, archaeologists, historians, and anthropologists would be far greater served had the ancients included indexes and bibliographies along with their cuneiform tablets. These accounts were written as religious history in their context and presented to the people of that time and that place. The writers were establishing spiritual stories and a history of the origins of their people, but they were not presenting that information for the ages. In modern day, their stories have certainly been over-romanticized in the works of the late Zecharia Sitchin, who, while perhaps being onto something, pushed his theories too far in order to make things fit. But despite his mistranslations and abused usages of ancient text, he did create an intriguing fictional account of the descent of extraterrestrial beings to the earth, housing the Sumerian mythology in updated vernacular narrative. A prime example is when Sitchin, now if you've heard of Zecharia Sitchin and his work, this will mean something to you. A prime example is when Sitchin forced the word Nephilim to mean people of the fiery rockets. Now, Sitchin at best simply mistranslated the word, ignoring or misunderstanding the Aramaic usage blended with biblical Hebrew. The Nephilim were not the ones who came down from anywhere. They were the descendants, the offspring of those who actually did come down, namely the Watchers, the sons of God, the B'nai Ha-Elohim of Genesis chapter 6. At worst, Sitchin deliberately ignored linguistics, fabricated meanings in order to substantiate his personal theories. But it's easy to understand how he may have extrapolated word definition from the combination of language and pictographs, as many of the carvings and reliefs from ancient Sumer depict their gods as descending in winged or bull-like craft. Now, folks, this is where history is exciting. You've got to understand bits and pieces of it in order to illuminate what you're doing. So that's why we're going through this. By the way, these are some of the pictographs, the cylinder seals that Zecharia Sitchin used to decipher his story, the craft that was coming down. This looks like Owanes, the fish, half man god, these beings that rose out of the sea and gave forbidden knowledge. We talked about them in Nephilim, and the kings and so on. So I think this is meant to be Elil here on the old cylinder seal. So in modern day, okay, I mentioned that, over-romanticized by Sitchin. Let's see where I left off. Over on this page. The bigger issue. Oh, by the way, in this this particular picture right here, that cylinder seal. That's a first millennium seal showing descending Anunnaki, pictured as a worshiper and a fish-garbed sage before a stylized tree, with a crescent moon and the descending winged disc set in the sky above it. Behind this group is another plant form with a radiant star, and the star cluster, the Pleiades cluster, shows up there. In the background is the dragon of Marduk, with Marduk's spear and Nabu's standard upon its back. That's what's shown in that picture. There you go. That's it right there. All of that junk I just talked about is right there in that cylinder seal. Okay? And these cylinder seals, by the way, were rolled up. They had to unroll them to get these images. The bigger issue is that Sitchin, in desiring to update the mythology and bring it into a more relevant understanding of ancient astronaut theory, simply did not do his homework. He rather, like many of the theoretical metaphysicists of our age, stated that things were so based solely on his misinterpretations of language and his continual forcing of the square peg into the round hole. It's like grasping to the farthest possible meaning of a word, the broadest associative definition, and utilizing that obscure definition as the rock-solid basis for your entire hypothesis. That can only end in disastrous interpretation or ultimately faulty conclusions. When Sitchin refers to the Nephilim as the people of the fiery rockets, he's gone far out of his way and deep into a misunderstanding of the Sumerian language in order to establish his hypothesis. Now listen to this, folks. His argument for ancient rockets and fiery spaceflight is constructed completely on two ancient Sumerian words, mu and me, which are the same words as the Akkadian shamu and the Hebrew Shem. Continuing in this argument to establish the ancient spacecraft theory, Sitchin goes on to contend that the Tower of Babel account in Genesis, in which the people wanted to make for themselves a Shem, is in reality describing the construction of a flying craft or a rocket of some sort. In his book, The 12th Planet, Sitchin defines the Sumerian word mu as meaning an oval-shaped conical object, as well as that which rises straight. The problem is that Mr. Sitchin merely defines the word, but offers up no linguistic etymology to define it within the framework of Sumerian language. He simply states the meaning and continues building on his hypothesis. However, it's interesting to note that the ancient Sumerians created their own dictionary thousands of years ago, and it contains the word mu. And that mu is spelled M-U, by the way. The entry in the ancient Sumerian dictionary has the word mu being synonymous with the Akkadian word shamu, meaning heaven, part of the sky, sometimes rain. This is what the word means according to the ancient scribes, who make no mention of flying craft or fiery rocket ships. It's simply a descriptive noun for the sky. The Sumerian word me, M-E, is used for the same meaning, as part of the heavens. And that's just the linguistics. Zechariah Sitchin represents to me a man who had a deep-set interest in discovering who we are and where we came from. His research into ancient Mesopotamian culture to look for ancient answers is admirable, while all at once woefully incomplete and academically insincere. In other words, bullshit. Peter James, co-author of the controversial book Centuries of Darkness, has leveled his own criticisms against Sitchin's scholarship, pointing out that he not only deliberately had to disregard the rest of the known world outside Sumer and Mesopotamian civilization, but also for his seemingly innate understanding or misunderstanding of Babylonian literature. David, the Akkadians, from Akkad, Akkad, Sumer and Akkad, the two cities we mentioned at the beginning that were in the Euphrates River Valley. These are two cradles of civilization towns, if you will. It's like Enki was the god of the Akkadians, or he was known as Ea in Akkad. So the Akkadians were just another city-state type of culture that had its own, like Eridu. You had Eridu, you had the city of Uruk, you had the cities of Akkad and Sumer. Akkad is the Akkadians. Now, right here, here's what where I was going with this. I ended that sentence to answer David there. From Centuries of Darkness. Sitchin uses the epic of creation, the Enuma Elish, as the foundation for his cosmogony, identifying the young god Marduk, who overthrows the older regime of gods and creates the earth as the unknown 12th planet. In order to do so, he interprets the Babylonian theogony as factual account of the birth of the other 11 planets. The Babylonian names for the planets are established beyond a shadow of a doubt. Ishtar was the deity of Venus, Nergal of Mars, Marduk of Jupiter, and confirmed by hundreds of astronomical anthological tables and treatises on clay tablets and papyri from the Hellenistic period. Sitchin merrily ignores all of this and assigns unwarranted planetary identities to the gods mentioned in the theogony. For example, Apsu, attested as god of the primeval waters, becomes, of all things, the sun. Ea, as it suits Sitchin, is sometimes planet Neptune and sometimes a spaceman. And the identity of Ishtar as the planet Venus, a central figure of Mesopotamian religion, is nowhere even mentioned in his book. Instead, Sitchin arbitrarily assigns to Venus another deity from the Enuma Elish, and reserves Ishtar for a role as a female astronaut. So there you go. William Irwin Thompson, well-known social philosopher and cultural critic, ergo a man who makes his living criticizing and poking tongue-in-cheek jabs, writer and publisher of poetry throughout his career, and a recipient of the Oslo International Poetry Festival Award, in 1986 describes his personal writing and speaking style as mind jazz on ancient texts. Thompson had this to say about what he calls Sitchin's literalism. What Sitchin sees is what he needs for his hypothesis. So figure 15 on page 40 is radiation therapy, and figure 71 on page 136 is a god inside a rocket-shaped chamber. If these are gods, why are they stuck with our cheap B-movie technology of rockets, microphones, spacesuits, and radiation therapy? Or as Jeff and I often muse, Jeff Doherty and I, Captain Kirk, excuse me, what does God need with a starship? If they are gods, then why can't they have some really divine technology, such as intradimensional wormhole travel, anti-gravity, starlight propulsion, or black hole bounce rematerializations? Sitchin has constructed what appears to be a convincing argument, but when he gets close to single images on ancient tablets, he falls back into literalism of, here is an image of the gods and rockets. Suddenly, ancient Sumer is made to look like the movie set for Destination Moon. Eric von Daniken's potboiler, Chariots of the Gods, has the same problem. The plain of Nazca in Peru is turned into a World War II landing strip. The gods can cross galactic distances, but by the time they get to Peru, their spaceships are imagined as World War II prop jobs that need an enormous landing strip that looks like an animal. And this literalization of the imagination doesn't make any sense. But every time it doesn't, you hear Sitchin say, there can be no doubt, but... So this is what disturbs me the most about Sitchin. As someone who's invested in wanting to know more about our origins and who is thoroughly intrigued with the ancient astronaut theory, I have to admit that such small words as mu and me can redefine the entire theory as put forward by Sitchin, who I still contend has some good ideas brewing, but has relied far too heavily and foolhardily on his own translations and perhaps even deliberate squeezing of a definition to fit his overall theory. You know, it would be kind of like me or any historian trying to establish the date of something and finding and correlate it to ancient kings or something like that, and finding that those kings lived in a different time period than his own hypothesis, but he stretches it back anyway and says, well, we can maybe stretch that date forwards. You're trying to change facts in order to fit your theories. That's exactly what my professor from seminary told me when he said, make sure that you filter all your historical research through the Bible. And I said, how can I do that and have any kind of integrity to facts? I said, maybe they'll end up being the same thing, but what if they're not? I can't just fall back on the Bible because I believe that by faith. That's what Sitchin has done here. Only it wasn't a faith issue with him. It was one of stretching the facts and the linguistics to fit his theory. So it made it sound right. But it's complete bullshit is the problem. All right. Folks, language is important. It's so important that even the Bible refers to itself as a book that is so God-breathed that is infallible. It's infallible and cannot be changed by one jot or tittle, which are Hebrew punctuation marks. That's in Matthew 51:18. You find that. The tiniest of Hebrew punctuation marks. Simply put, the writers of Hebrew scripture were using language as a gauge of authenticity. That is an ultimately strong point on which theories can rise or fall. And we have archaeologists to thank for the deciphering of ancient mythological texts. Who knew 5,000-year-old dictionary would come in so handy? I wish Sitchin had referred to it, as that would, for me, not cast such broad dispersion or aspersions on his interpretations and subsequent theories. Does this, or should it, delegitimize Sitchin's theories and his dozen-plus books on the topic? A most definitive yes, on my part. If you're going to present theory based on scholarship, would it not be important to first ensure that the scholarship is sound? In turn, should this then delegitimize ancient alien theory that adheres to similar yet differing hypotheses as Sitchin's? Not necessarily. Better scholarship on the topic needs to be established, and in the end, we may not come up drawing the same conclusions that were the object of our original hypothesis. In Sumerian mythology, Enki, Ea, and the neighboring Akkadian religion, is the god of craft, mischief, intelligence, and knowledge. He is also known as the god over the waters and creation. And although the exact meaning of his name is uncertain, the common translation is Lord of the Earth. When you compare him to Nakash in the book of Genesis, you find similar definitions as the trickster and bringer of mischief. When you keep in mind the etymology of making mischief, you will find that its origins have little to do with what we consider to be mischief by modern standards. Mischief was in its earliest forms equated with chaos, havoc, and the committing of rebellious acts. There is such overt similarity between the acts of Enki Ea and the serpent in the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis that it cannot be overlooked. The traditional story tells us that the serpent is none other than Satan, the devil, Lucifer. However, the serpent is never called by any of those names in the text. Those are names attributed to the serpent in Genesis thousands of years after, well, literally just 1,000 years after. I lost my place. Where am I? Thousands of years later in the scriptural writings of the Hebrew Bible. What is clear is that Nakash, the serpent character in the Eden story in the Hebrew language, is a member of the divine council, the Elohim. As I covered extensively in the rise and fall of the Nephilim, Psalm 82 presents a cast of minor gods referred to as the Elohim, the bright shining princes of heaven. This plural form of the word Elohim was uttered in the text by the singular Elohim, who equates them to himself. For most evangelicals, there is a problem in that the Old Testament here affirms the existence of a multiplicity of Elohim, a many number of gods. Though simple, the solution requires us to think like an ancient Semitic Israelite, and not as a product of the Reformation or the modern evangelicalism that exists today in our modern churches. Biblical theology did not begin with modern evangelicalism, the Calvins, the Luthers, the Aquinas, or even the Augustines. It began with the ancient text as it stands, understood with the historical, cultural, and religious context that preceded it. The first occurrence of Elohim is correctly translated God, and is obviously to be taken as the singular form of the word for reasons of grammatical subject-verb agreement. The second use of the word, Elohim, in this passage is to be equally understood as being in the plural form because it is the object of the sentence and its preposition. The grammar and syntax are crystal clear in this psalm, in that a singularity cannot preside from within a singularity. It is clear by the language of the text that Elohim, the singular, is presiding over the Elohim, the plural, and is repeated a second time later in the short psalm. Both God and the gods are represented by the identical word Elohim. Boom. So in understanding the text, the context of what was being written in its day, it's not going to be the same as what we might understand in our evangelical church. Now, folks, we've been going for an hour and 37 minutes. I'm not done with this chapter. There's 5 pages left. Should we finish this chapter? I think we'll make it. And then we'll go through and look at some stuff, and we'll call this a long one tonight. We've had a couple of long chapters. So here we go. The next section in this chapter. It must be Satan. Follow me, as we used to say. By definition, Nakash, the bright shining one, later he becomes known as Lucifer, who in his pre-fallen state is the bright and shining presence and defender of the glory of God, the bright and morning star, which is also a reference, by the way, if you haven't noticed this, the descriptors for Lucifer, the bright and morning star. That's also a reference that's used for the Messiah, for Jesus, much later. More on that in this chapter. He's also known as the bringer of knowledge and intelligence, the illuminator. When Nakash seduced Eve by the offering of forbidden fruit, that forbidden information that would make humans just as Elohim, or gods, as Genesis 3:22 states, he became the bringer of knowledge and the emancipator of the intellect. For after the forbidden fruit was accepted and eaten, the humans knew that they were naked. They knew that there was more to their existence than simply caring for the garden, for the superior being who bred them. And the Lord God said, this is Genesis 3:23-23, and the Lord God said, the man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. So the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. The Sumerian tablets tell us that the rebel god named Enki-Ea was extraterrestrial, not of this earth, human. Remember, I've said many times, when I state the word extraterrestrial, it simply means not of this earth. Doesn't necessarily mean aliens, the way we think of them, the big black almond-shaped eye aliens. It could simply mean celestial beings. It could be angels. It could be God himself. Extraterrestrials. Being appointed by the chief god of the Anunnaki, Enlil, to create Homo sapiens. After his involvement with the original genetic experiment that bequeathed the slave race of humans bred to do the work for the Anunnaki, as paralleled in the Keepers of the Garden in Genesis, in the Garden of Eden, his comparison for the plight of the slave race shifted his role as a genetic engineer to that of a veritable rebel leader. His actions flew in the face of the rest of his kind. Now, this passage I'm going to read here is from the cuneiform texts, Atrahasis 1:7. It says, "Now there was one Atrahasis, whose ear was open to his god Enki." By the way, Atrahasis is the king of the humans, the city of Eridu. "Whose ear was open to his god Enki. He would speak with his god, and his god would speak with him. Atrahasis made his voice heard, and spoke to his lord. How long will the gods make us suffer? Will they make us suffer illness forever? Enki made his voice heard and spoke to his servant. Call the elders, the senior men. Start an uprising in your own house. Let heralds proclaim. Let them make loud noise in their land. Do not revere your gods. Do not pray to your goddesses." It's also related in the Sumerian text that Ea's headquarters of operation were in the swampy backwater region called the Snake Marsh, also referred to as a den to many reptiles and serpents. In other words, the first fight for freedom of the human race from the gods took place in an area known as Ea's Den, or Ea Den. This is in the Sumerian texts, by the way. Enki-Ea was originally the god of the ancient Sumerian city Eridu, known for being the first and oldest city mentioned throughout Sumerian literature. It's closely associated with Uruk, which in its language means first city, as built in the biblical tradition by Cain. Uruk is the city that Cain was supposed to have gone and built. I don't know if I get into it in this book or if I wrote it in an article, because I haven't reviewed this. When it says Cain was driven out of Eden after he murdered his brother Abel, Adam and Eve being his dad, he goes east to the land of Nod, marries a wife, builds a city, names the city after his son, Enoch. Enoch linguistically translates through time and transmission of language, morphing of language into Uruk. Enoch became Uruk. Uruk is the same base word for Iraq. And so Uruk, meaning first city, was built in the biblical tradition by Cain. Cain was the Nephilim's son of Eve and Nakash, while his brother Abel was the son of Adam and Eve. Closely associated with the city of Eridu is the mythical region below the earth's surface known as the Abzu, which is often interpreted as an underground sweetwater ocean in Mesopotamian mythology. By the way, I included this painting, and it's much more glorious in color. It's the ancient city of Eridu as envisioned by archaeological artist Balazs Balo. And I use this by permission from the artist. But you can see his stuff as archaeologyillustrated.com is his website. But this was his conception of the city of Eridu, which was a real city, by the way. It's not a mythological city. And the king Atrahasis ruled over this city. And it's on the backwaters, as you can see, he's pictured it here, the backwaters of the Euphrates River. So that was the flow of life was the water. The geographical characteristics and features of the ancient site of the city of Eridu must have had great impact both physically and spiritually with the original concept of the Abzu. It's difficult to imagine what exactly made the place sacred to the ancient Sumerians, mostly due to the fact that there are no direct references or depictions of the original landscape and terrain. However, where there was water in these arid desert regions, there was life. And it was also in these geographical places that civilizations were established and flourished. Eridu was situated in a marshy and continuously flooded area in the backwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where it can be easily deduced by geographical patterns that some natural phenomenon of flooding and receding marsh waters took place. And it was perceived by the ancient inhabitants of Eridu to be sacred nature at work. The concept of the Abzu was derived from the waterways and clear lagoons that encompassed the city of Eridu. The surrounding river backwaters were also referred to as a marshy den that physically created a sanctuary setting enclosing the sacred city, where eventually a cult arose dedicated to the god and or goddess of sweet water. And I have a footnote for that as well. The earliest form of the god Enki could have been Abzu, who was later seen as being conquered or vanquished by Enki, who then stepped into the place of Abzu, which in turn became known as his domain. This sort of alteration of concepts, where an ancient deity becomes a mere attribute of a more contemporary evolved divine figure, was a common attributable alteration when the god took on the function or the act of a certain deed or a natural phenomenon, such as took place in the rising and falling of the waters surrounding Eridu. And make no mistake, the changing of the names of the deities was common practice among the ancients, this being clearly illustrated as the many names for God in the Old Testament alone: Jehovah, Elohim, El Shaddai, Adonai, the angel of the Lord, and many others. As well as the biblical record of the divine changing of the names of some of the early patriarchs. Abram of Ur became Abraham. Jacob became Israel. Joseph being renamed by the Egyptians as Zaphath-Paneah. Saul of Tarsus renamed Paul the Apostle. And even the Messiah had evolutionary progressive name changes and addition as the function of the Messiah grew and burgeoned. Kinsman Redeemer, the Lion of Judah, the Lamb of God, the Rod of Jesse, of the royal house of King David, which did not exist until thousands of years after the earliest form of Messiah was used, and so on. The meanings of names was all important in ancient religion, and the owner of the name change generally followed the rule of change equates function, designation, or purpose. In antiquity, one deity might have had several names used for him simultaneously, as mentioned previously with the several names for God and the Messiah in the Hebrew Bible. During the course of time, as older names disappeared or developed into newer names with greater contemporary meaning, the older name incorporated as an attribute of its newer function. However, it should be taken into consideration that an original meaning of the name of a deity might mean nothing at all to a community of people using that name many centuries after the name was first uttered. Look to the Tetragrammaton, the Paleo-human or Hebrew name of the god YHWH, Yahweh, Jehovah. It must have been a translatable meaning. Very early on, prior to the writing of the Hebrew scriptures, when the Hebrew religion was in an early state of development and still in its infancy, yet much later, when Moses composed the Hebrew scriptures and encoded Judaism around 1400 BCE, which also contained the law for the Hebrew people, establishing the foundations of the Jewish religion, demonstrates signs that the name Yahweh, YHWH, was still rather ambiguous and had no direct translation. And it's highly possible that the original meaning of Yahweh had no importance whatsoever for the Hebrews who lived much later, where in 5th century BCE, they used several divine names for God, all more than likely referring to older deities in older layers of Israelite religion. The form and pronunciation of YHWH, Yahweh, although considered as sacred, as was the deity behind the name itself, was never altered. It was simply retained as part of the growing list of attributable names for the Hebrew God. Get that? All of this is highly important to understanding the name of Enki-Ea, the evolution of his name being much similar. Even if Enki-Ea once had a clearly translatable meaning that was understandable to ancient Sumerian people, that original meaning was not necessarily understood by the Mesopotamian people living in the 3rd millennium city-states of Sumer and neighboring Akkad. But the name Enki, specifically the Akkadian version, Ea, did migrate into the Canaanite region from the Mesopotamian region throughout the course of the following millennia and a half. The name Ea became the base Canaanite word YHWH, pronounced Yahweh, the Hebrew name Jehovah. This is all important in understanding how the idea of the serpent became the basis for the Genesis account of the Garden of Eden's serpent character, Nakash. The direct translation of the Sumerian name Enki, recorded as divine Sumerian name in written sources since the composition of the text, literally translates as Lord Earth or Lord of the Earth, extending to the meaning of he who ruled beneath the earth, the Abzu, and had dominion over it. Sounds like Satan, doesn't it? The problem is that, although Enki-Ea has incredible mythological linkage to the serpent in the Bible, the name Ea is the early form of the name Yahweh, Jehovah. There is some sort of a twist in meaning that has taken place along the millennia, and there is some theoretical yet highly heretical surmising that the two characters are perhaps one and the same. Lucifer and Jehovah, at least etymologically, if not theologically, were they both the pantheon of the Elohim? The connectivity between Enki-Ea, who brought forbidden knowledges of the gods to early humans, from a place known as the Snake Den, Ea's Den, or Ea Den, or Eden, as it became known in Genesis, is undeniably connected to the character of Nakash, who was the illuminator and the bringer of forbidden knowledge to Adam and Eve in the Genesis story of the Garden of Eden. Yet he is etymologically linked to Jehovah, the savior of humanity. That's the end of chapter 1. What do you think? There's a lot of meat there. This is the stuff that made me start thinking about the way I was taught, the things I was told I should believe. Because you start getting into the languages, the original stuff, the history, the context of the day. You will find that these things mean different things than we thought they did. It's all important to know how the ancients interpreted things in order to understand, in their understanding, in order to understand what we have done to those words in the transmission of that word down through time and culture. I take a sip of my cold coffee now. Let's see. Let me go back a little bit and see if there's some stuff to talk about. All right. I'm looking. Let me just scroll back. Let's go back to the beginning of some of this stuff. Audrey, I've made you a moderator, by the way, just as you are with Rocky's show, and Rocky and I are on. I've just elevated you to the lofty status without asking your permission. All right, I'm going back to see if there's anything that really stands out here. Uh, Lord of the Earth says 523325. Joy. If Joy is your name, well, let's just go by Joy. You're the only Joy in here. Lord of the Earth, Scotty, the word bothers me. Must have been part of the serfdom in years past. I think, and of course, serfdomhood was, of course, later in medieval times. You had the equivalency of serfs in ancient times. But I think you're right there. And Lord of the Earth, Lord was just a man. God is called the angel of the Lord. That's himself. And so Lord being supposedly giving title. Leslie said, fork-tongued serpent is evil incarnate, Satan or otherwise. I agree. It has that look. Well. I'm sorry. I'm looking at it as if you're speaking metaphorically. Literally, fork-tongued serpent. Here's the thing. They're beautiful. If you can get beyond the fork-tongued, lickety-splitty tongue, and some of them want to eat you or bite you or whatever. Serpents, reptilians, are beautiful creatures when you look at them from an artistic standpoint or a creative standpoint. So everything we've been told has been inverted, says Barbara Williams. Yeah, I think you're right there. Leslie asks, is that before or after he was a fallen angel? Not quite sure what specific point you're referring to there, but Lucifer, according to the scripture, was a fallen angel. Perhaps part of his fall was the Garden of Eden incident, but we don't know that because we don't know that was really Lucifer. Here's the problem. The Nakash of the Garden of Eden is never said to be Satan, Lucifer, the devil, any of those characters. If this is pre-fall, it would have been Lucifer. That was his name pre-fall. But the problem is, Lucifer was an archangel. These are not angels. These are Elohim. Unless the archangels were part of the divine council and part of that. But they were not Elohim. They were Malachim. So therein lies the problem. We don't know if this was Lucifer, if there's an understanding we're missing. And the attribution of Lucifer to the Garden of Eden and the serpent was made 1,000 years after Moses wrote the account. So what do you do with that? We don't know. Catholics sing about Lucifer and worship him. Lewis, I'm not sure what that is. I don't know about that. Maybe illuminate me a little bit on that. If they sing about Lucifer and worship him. Remember the TV show Twin Peaks, says Joy? David Lynch, The Inverted World. Yes, I do. Cat O' Nine Tails, she's saying howdy to everybody. Let's see. Leslie, Lewis Boyce, I was born and raised Catholic, she says. Okay. I must have missed that because anything and everything that has to do with Satan makes me literally sick. Okay. I get that. Now, Leslie, and I mentioned here, and this is a challenge to some people's thinking, and I'm not stating this as fact. I'm stating this as a comparison that's been made, is that there's a thinking that the Elohim, this divine council, these were all the sons of God, those of the Elohim. They were the demigods or the gods of heaven, as Elohim, God, declares them. Lucifer was one of them. It is said that Jesus, the being that became Jesus, was one of them. But he then took on the attributes of the only begotten Son of God, the Savior, the kinsman redeemer. But that all morphed from the beginning of the first prophecies all the way down to the time when the New Testament says he came to earth. And the reason I use some guarded language with this is I struggle with that. That was my faith for a very long time, but I struggle with it because you just don't know for sure anymore. Because it all starts to look like every other religion's different versions of things. I don't think I'm explaining that clearly. I think I've explained it well in the reading and at other points earlier than tonight. But when you've got something that looks like something else, you have to ask your question and say, is that something else applied here or not? So the whole idea of Lucifer, the star of the morning, the bright and morning star, the protector of the glory of God, and so on. These same titles are used for the description of the Messiah. So what do we do with that? So terrestrial would mean of this earth. Yes, cat. How they make us stupid. Yeah. Let's see. I don't mind. I'm new kind of all of this. Says Lewis. That's cool, Lewis. I've never seen Twin Peaks. I remember when it was on TV. None of the heavenly are from the earth. Says Ron Frisbee. Correct. Kat says all of these church leaders and government leaders need to be hung for hundreds of years of crimes against humanity. Different topic, but yeah, I think you're right. That has gone on for centuries. I think part of crimes to humanity, look at what humanity believes when you adhere to Christianity nowadays. What if we were taught the wrong stuff? As that's what I found. That's why I've drifted from that faith, was because I realized that there is stuff out there that we were not taught. And I want to shake these guys by the hooded collar. Why the hell weren't we taught these things? Why were they deleted? Who bestowed upon you the ability to change the scripture or to change what was said, what was done, the history? And of course, this is where I think the Pope, one of the reasons why he was made infallible, made the voice of God on earth. So he had the ability to do political changes within the church itself, which then again proved to me that if there's a guy that's a pope and he's going to start changing the rules of your faith, and he says it's a dispensation from God, and he knows damn well it's not, is he doing that to control the masses? That's the big question. That's the problem that starts to raise its ugly head. Ron said he was never on board with organized religion. I was very deeply for a time. Not now. Kat says, I think the earth is bigger than we are being told. It's exactly as we're told in a garden, a small hidden place to grow things. Let's see. Where did you go, Scotty? Leslie asks. Nowhere. And I'm hardwired, by the way. I shouldn't have any glitches from my end anymore. So now that I've hardwired things instead of wireless for these shows, and it's midnight, 2 minutes after, so I'm going to wrap this up pretty quick. Kat says, God is a universal law of order, and they are the false prophets, the sheep herders. I'm not sure what you're referencing there, Kat, so I'm going to leave that just stand as your comment. Am I the only one who has lost Scotty? Leslie lost me. I still hear him. Scotty's not breaking up or buffering here. I think, Leslie, it might have been your internet connection. I think my connection's been pretty solid tonight. Not positive of that, but it's been solid since I went hardwire. Joy says, I think the Christ mind is beautiful, and there's a wonderful book called The Reflections of the Christ Mind by Paul Ferrara. It's about love and compassion, not vengeance and judgment. I think you're right there, Joy, in that there's a true message of the Messiah, and then there's a message that the church and others have attributed to the Messiah over the centuries. Yeah, Leslie, and anybody, if you ever have connectivity problems, just reboot or refresh the feed and see what happens. Let's see. Blah, 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 blah. I'm going on and on and on. Scotty must have got a new ISP. No, I actually just plugged into my modem instead of went wireless. I'm way on the other end of the house. So I went and got a 50-foot cable, and I just hardwired to my modem. Boom, I'm on. Let's see, Snake's Den or Eden, cool. I thought that was a very cool thing the first time I heard it. Cool in the respect that it offered up some explanation. Ea, being the Akkadian name for Enki, Ea was said to have come up out of the Serpent's Den, the Abzu, the great underground sea, into the marshy areas where he is said around Eridu to have existed as the patron god of the city of Eridu. And explaining it again, the Serpent's Den, or the marshy areas, became known as Ea's Den. This is where he existed. Ea's Den, in the Sumerian culture, as translated into the Hebrew culture, became Eden. It was Ea's Den, became Ea's Den, Eden. And you can see all these similarities. We're going to cover more of them in the book again. Rocky does appreciate the hardwired connection. And I appreciate Rocky for appreciating my hardwired connection. And my connection would freeze up during the show, and we couldn't figure out why. And I think it's just my signal got weak because it was too far from the modem. So we just hardwired it, and it seems to work. Thank you, Audrey, ScottAllenRoberts.com. Thank you very much. Thank you. Let's see. The Spirit Science channel just came out with a great video about Scotty. Oh, it did? Oh, about it, Scotty. Okay, good. I'm going to have to take a look at that. Let's see. The etymology is fascinating. Yes, it is, Michelle. And I hope you really enjoyed. Thank you, Leslie. You enjoyed tonight. There's a lot to process. And this stuff, like I say, I do not want to be somebody that sends somebody adrift from their faith because of what I'm telling you. That makes me no better than any of these guys I decry down through history who changed the story for their political means or uses. But I'm rather like Richard Feynman, who said, I may have put it at the end of this book, so I'm going to look for it and see if I've got it in here again. Richard Feynman, who was, it's right here, toward the end of the book, but this is just a quote from Richard Feynman. If you remember Richard Feynman, contemporary of Einstein and Oppenheimer, astrophysicist, did a lot of lectures. You can find him online on YouTube. Look up Richard Feynman, F-Y-N-E-M-A-N. Gave some great lectures and talks, and he was very personable, very easy to listen to. He said this: I can't believe the special stories that have been made up about our special relationship to the universe, because they seem too simple, too connected, too local, too provincial. The earth, or to listen to Feynman say, he'd say, the earth. Yeah, this New York accent. The earth, he came to the earth. One of the aspects of God came to the earth, mind you. And look at what's out there. It just isn't in proportion. Anyway, it's no use arguing it. We should look to see what's true and what may not be true. Once you start doubting, which for me is a fundamental part of my soul, to doubt and ask, and to doubt and ask, it gets a little harder to believe. And Feynman also said at one point, he said, he says, I would rather die not knowing than die believing something that I will find not to be so. And that's kind of where we're at. So absorb this stuff. Think about it. If you have questions, send them to me. Put them down below. If you like this broadcast, hit the like button down below. I'd appreciate that as well. We've now gone 2 hours, 8 minutes, and 36 seconds since I started. So we're going to wrap it here. Thank you for sticking with me for so long tonight. It was a long chapter, a lot of detailed information. But I hope it's something that was beneficial to you, only in the sense that it makes you think. And if you have questions, pose them. And we'll be back. Let's see, today is Friday. Tomorrow's Saturday. If you're all right with it, I'm going to do another one of these tomorrow. And so I'll see you then. Thanks for being here. Thanks for continuing to be here, and I appreciate it. Go to my website, ScottAllenRoberts.com. All you have to do, if you can't remember that, just go out to my main page here on YouTube, and over in the corner somewhere it has I think it's way off to the right. It's got, I'm going this way because as you're looking at this video, I think it's that way. If you go off to the right, it's got my website you can click on. Also, buy my stuff. If you want the t-shirts we do for the Patriot stuff, go to Etsy.com, ETSY. And that is Etsy.com/shop/son-of-a-patriot. And you can find my shirts and things like that. And I'm going to keep adding stuff to that. So come on and take a look. And of course, my books are available on Amazon. You can go to my website, ScottAllenRoberts.com, click on any of that, and you can find it. And all of my links are in the chat. As Audrey just said, thank you, Audrey. And so again, one final time, good night. Thanks for being here. I'll see you again tomorrow.